Good evening, thanks for coming. Richard says he will do the formal thanks, so I'm going to get on with it. I want to begin this brief introduction with a question. What is a revisionist historian? It's an important question because it's what Richard Rosenfeld calls himself, and it's what he's been called by many others. Without oversimplifying it, the root of the term revisionist is really vision, which is a seeing. So a revision is literally a re-seeing, or more literally, just taking another look. In the review of his book, American Aurora, the LA Times called Richard's work revisionist history, fresh from its thorough grounding in the sources. These sources were the newspapers, broadsheets, and pamphlets, by the way, from the late 18th century that Richard took another look at as he offered us a revised story for the founding of this country. Because a revisionist historian is not just someone who takes another look, but takes the next and harder step of retelling what he or she sees. That same review by the LA Times also called Richard a master storyteller. So let's listen to what he has to tell us about his most recent history project on the origins of democracy in Western civilization. Richard Rosenfeld.
The Roman Empire didn't occupy all of Europe. It occupied Western Europe up to the Rhine, and it occupied, it didn't occupy Germany, it didn't occupy Scandinavia, didn't occupy Caledonia, actually that the Romans call it, that's Scotland, or Hibernia, Ireland. Those places were independent. They weren't exposed to Latin. They were basically illiterate, and and those tribes from those places, really all of them, one way or the other, attacked the Britons in England, pushed them west to Wales, southeast into Brittany, which is called Little Britain in France. And this is the story of these tribes and their movement into England and what they brought with them, and the arguments of various politicians as to what we should look to from each of them. The American founders asked questions about history in the start of this country. They asked where their rights came from, whether they came from the Magna Carta, or, as many Democrats said before, earlier than Magna Carta, back in Anglo-Saxon England, and that's where they identified the rights which are democratic rights. And of course, Democrats were looking for unalienable rights, natural law, natural rights, and they were looking to find a heritage of this that they could use as an answer to the structure of lords, commoners, and kings, which was the history of England. Now, the choice was which historical model should they follow? The Roman Republic, which is a tripartite government, or the Athenian democracy, city-states of Athens. In the United States, there were people who did not want to have this structure of an executive branch, a Senate, a House of Representatives. Today, we have a Senate where states with 15% of the population have more seats in the Senate than states with 85% of the population, and they can outvote the 85%. In England, you have an unelected House of Lords and an unelected monarch who play a role in American English politics, again, unelected, undemocratic. But there were people in both places that wanted a democracy and didn't want this structure. In the United States, Thomas Paine, Franklin, they didn't want to have a Senate. They didn't want to have an executive branch. And Jefferson, too, didn't want a Senate with powers of the sort it has. But Adams won the argument. He won the argument by publishing one year before the Constitutional Convention the first volume of 3 volumes he published on defending the idea of a tripartite system with a governor, Senate, House of Representatives as the model for the United States. And that model came out, the Constitutional Convention was 1787 to 1786, and by most people, way of telling it, that volume persuaded America to adopt this tripartite system. The Roman models for local governments were basically three. There were the Romans themselves, and they looked to this Greek historian. There was a Greek historian named Polybius who was captured by Rome in 146 BC when Rome took over Greece and Carthage, and wrote a history of why Rome was so strong, and that was because of this tripartite structure of government. The Greeks were in the unicameral ideas. Paine and Franklin, who didn't want to have a senate or executive, they argued for a Greek model, which is a unicameral model, and that's it. And there was this other group, the Saxons, whom a Roman historian, Tacitus, wrote about 98 AD in his work Germania. And in England and in the United States, those who were arguing for a more liberal constitution, weakening this tripartite structure, looked to the Saxons and told the story of the Saxons. And that's what this talk is about. So we're going to talk about the leading Democrat in the United States, how he saw the Saxons, understanding that the Saxon argument in both countries lost. The Saxons, the argument that won was the argument that favored Rome, Roman Republic, not the Saxon model I'm about to discuss. So this is a losing argument, but it's an argument with retelling, and my offering to you is to offer you an alternative to that telling, which might have persuaded the country and England to adopt a more liberal, a more popular model of government than they adopted. They didn't have the argument that I'm going to offer tonight. So Thomas Jefferson, there's the man. Thomas Jefferson, after the Declaration of Independence was written in early July of 1776, Thomas Jefferson and others went forward to create a great seal of the United States to represent the brand new country. And this is the seal that Jefferson offered in August of 1776, proposed as the seal of the United States. And on it were two figures, Hengist and Horsa. Now, all of you say, well, who is Hengist and Horsa? You've never heard about America. Why wasn't that taught to me in school? Well, here's what Jefferson said about this seal that he proposed. He said, Hengist and Horsa were the Saxon chiefs from whom we claim the honor of being descended, and whose political principles and form of government we have assumed. So now you know who Hengist and Horsa are, right? Okay, so the idea, Jefferson's idea of the Saxons and what they did and what they brought to England is reflected in a variety of comments he made. When he abolished feudalism, he saw it as a restitution of Saxon laws. The happiest system, the wisest, most perfect system of governance. He saw the earlier stages of Saxon settlement, that the ancestors held their lands in absolute dominion, fee simple absolute we'd call it today, where you own your own property and do what you want with it, without any obligations to a lord or superior, and answering to and the feudalists called allodial. Allodial is the same thing as fee simple absolute. So Thomas Jefferson said that the common law existed when the Anglo-Saxons were pagans, and here's the most important point. The Whig, the liberal, in England and in the United States, argued his rights based on this old Saxon law, based on the early law of England when these tribes first came in. The Tory starts with the with the Norman, and that basically means the Magna Carta, which accepts the idea that there's going to be a king and lords and someone below, and a just power between those three. So where did Jefferson get his ideas about the Saxons? Well, the answer is it came from a story about what happened once the Romans left England. Now, you have to understand that in England itself, you had the Picts in Scotland, you had the Scoties really in Ireland, and the Picts were very tough, and they always beat up on the Britons, and so did the Scoties, but the Romans kept things under control. The Picts were so strong the Romans couldn't conquer them. They built the Hadrian's Wall. to protect themselves from the Picts. So the Britain's king, a guy named Vortigern, needed help. After the Romans left, the Picts began to attack the Britons, and the king needed help. So he looked to the continent, and there were Saxons, Angles, and Jutes, and Jutes. So the Saxons and the Angles are the ones we know about. We think of England as Anglo-Saxon. The Angles and the Saxons predominate. So let's press on with this.
Richard, before you do, we want to put the lights up so we can see you a little bit, as well as a slideshow.
Okay.
It's been done. Thank you.
Okay. So, close to the mic. Okay. So, how did Jefferson get to have this view of things? He got it from. It was basically this view of the Saxons was the view that predominated in England and the United States among liberals, among Democrats, small d Democrats. And his mentor in the United States, Richard Bland, explained it this way. He said, "It is sure shooting the Constitution of England derives from the Saxons who came over to the assistance of the Britons at the time of King Vortigern, and they established a form of government with the most perfect liberty, and every freeholder was a member of the Witenagemot." Try to remember that word, it's new to you. Witenagemot is the parliament that they thought carried this democratic principle from the Saxons into England. So that's the story of how this happened. Now, this idea of the Saxons coming in and saving the king of England against the Picts was the story in England as well. Very prominent Whigs there. It says England's Whig politicians brought the Saxons no less lovers of liberty. Tacitus further describes, and I'll talk about Tacitus in a second, describing the nature of the Germans. Most important matters were determined popularly by all, very democratic. That's the way Tacitus told the story of the tribes of Germany. So, likewise, the historians told it the same way. The Saxons brought with them their laws, the government. The commons were an essential part, Tacitus tells us. And the Saxon government became united and kept their ancient Witenagemot, which is this parliament that was said had been brought to England by the Saxons. So here's what Tacitus, the Roman historian, actually said about the Saxons in describing the tribes of Germania. That's an area not included in the Roman Empire. They are barbarians to the Romans in the north. And here's what he said in this report, 98 AD, about them. He said, basically, the chiefs offer stuff. And what they offer, they offer for decision of the people. It's just by the chief. But if the proposal displeased, the assembly reject it by a murmur. If it's agreeable, they clash their javelins for an expression of assent at the time of arms. So basically what it is, all the free people to get together, the leaders would propose stuff, and the population at large in these meetings expressed an assent by clashing of javelins. So here's Germania. You can see there the Saxons, and we'll press on. This idea of what Tacitus wrote impressed all the great thinkers of Europe. This is Charles Montesquieu, who you may remember taught us about separation of powers, the judiciary from the legislative to the executive. That's where it comes from, this man. And he says that from the Germans, the English have borrowed the idea of the political government. This beautiful system was invented in the woods. So John Locke, who, as you all know, inspired our Constitution, and Jefferson and everybody else here, he says, the Saxons settled here secured a government by which the people had a share and without whose consent nothing could be imposed. So, James Madison, during the Constitutional Convention, developing our Constitution, observed that it's well ascertained that parts of the composed of British Constitution arose immediately from the forests of Germany. So, what do we call the tribal meeting that Tacitus describes? What Tacitus described is something called something you've never heard of, but is a core institution, which is called the Thing. The Thing is a gathering, as he describes, of all the free men of an area into a legislature where they all come together and they vote on customary law. They approve it. They also adjudicate things in the Thing, and they socialize there too. It's an outdoor event, and I'll show you a picture of what it looked like. And so it's a thing. It's a community meeting, and it was in the tribal life of Germania and a lot of other tribal life. This existed. So in every language at the time, it was called Thing. Ping, Thing. I give all the different languages, and in Scandinavia, even today, the Thing is the big. I'm suggesting that I need a slow water. Thanks, Michael. So, Scandinavia today, in every legislature, the signal of democracy is the fact that there's a Thing. In Denmark, it's the folk Thing. In Greenland, it's the land Thing. In Norway, it's Storting. In Sweden, it's the Thing. So, and in Iceland, the oldest legislature on earth is the All Thing. So the Thing is a core part of the Scandinavian thing. And here's what it looks like. You see the size of the house up there in the corner. You can see the scale of the meeting. This is the kind of meeting they had. They come together, there are mounds, there are booths around it where families could stay, and they come periodically during the year. And this is probably not an all thing site. This is probably a thing site smaller. And it's an outdoor gathering. It's a mound with booths, families, legislators. So since there's no writing in these things, the recording is by a law speaker, someone who remembers the law and says what it is and isn't. And that's how law is passed in these tribes. It's an oral tradition, and that's true most of the world before there was writing. So, and of course, there was this raising of weapons, and that's where we get hustings, that expression husting, going out on the hustings, going out and bringing the people together. That's where the word hustings comes from. So, pressing on here. So now we're going to discuss the arrival of these different tribes in England. And here there are very few sources we have for history in Anglo-Saxon England. And among them, the most prominent is the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle that was King Alfred compiled. And what he reports is that Hengist and Horsa were invited by Vortigern, the king of the Britons, to help them, and he fought against the Picts. Then he invited the Angles, and they to send more help, and they did. And then they sent for more help from the old Saxons. So the first people to arrive of Kent, inhabitants of the isle, are of Jewish origin. Their leaders were said to have been Hengist and Horsa. So what this tells us is, among other things, that Vortigern invited the Jews from Scandinavia, not the Saxons from Germany, to help fight the Picts. And in fact, the Saxons had been traditional enemies of the Briton, fighting with the Picts and Scoti against the Briton 100 years before, and so continuing to attack England that the east coast of England became known as the Saxon shore. So the Jutes, not Vortigern, invited the Angles, not the Jutes, invited the Saxons, and the Jutes feared the Saxons. They wouldn't have invited in the Saxons, and the Angles had coexisted with them peacefully. They lived south of them. So anyway, so this is, the Jutes feared the Saxons. Across the whole of Jutland, they built this wall, the Danevirk, in the 7th century, against Saxon attacks from south. And in fact, in England in the 7th century, the Jutes and the Saxons were constantly battling each other. So, and the legend of King Arthur we got from the sermon of Gildas. That legend is the story of the Britons fighting the Saxons, and how ferocious the Saxons were, and how heroic Arthur was, especially at the battle of Baden. So In the 5th century, you had, and here we go, you had the Jutes who came down and they settled Kent. You had the Angles who came in and settled these kingdoms, and you had the Saxons who brought in down in the south. Now, so here are the kingdoms created. As you'll see, the Jute was first, and what happened when Hengist and Horsa came into England, they ended up fighting with Vortigern after some time, and Horsa was killed. Hengist went on to found the kingdom of Kent, and then thereafter, the other Angles and the Saxons. Bretwalda means the ruler of all of England. So it shows that the kingdom of Kent in 455 was the Bretwalda in 590. So when the tribal law that Tacitus describes and all the other tribal law came in with these tribes into England, basically they brought tribal law. And as kingdoms were developed, and you had kings and and structures, the tribal law was put upon by the law of kings, domes, and different kinds of structures, law that the monarchy would impose. And that was very different. So the question is how much tribal law continued and how much was subsumed into the monarchy of each of these kingdoms. So, and that raises the question of whether one of these tribes actually brought in the thing that Tacitus described, the thing that the liberals in England and France identified as the Wittengemot, the legislature that the Saxons brought in the minds of these liberals in 17th and 18th century England and the United States. So here are the kingdoms of the heptarchy, as they call it, of Anglo-Saxon England. And you had, again, you got Kent is here, that's the Jute kingdom. And then the Saxon kingdoms are Essex, Sussex, and Wessex. Those are the Saxon kingdoms. And the Anglo kingdoms are Northumbria, Mercia, and East Anglia. Okay, so now my revisionist history where I tell all these guys where to go and what the real story is. Yeah, we start that now. So the Romans depart Britain, the Britons do battle with the Picts and the Scoti, and Hengist and Horsa lead the Jutes to help. The Jutes help Britons fight the Picts, and Hengist and Horsa turn against Vortigern. Horsa dies in the battle. Hengist establishes the first Anglo-Saxon kingdom, the Jutes' kingdom of Kent, and becomes its first king. This is Jutland. Jutland is, Jutland's called Jutland not because it juts from Germany, although it does. It's called Jutland because it's the land of the Jutes. And it represents 70% of what we call Denmark. It's this whole area. And the Jutes were a tribe in Jutland, and the Danes were a tribe in Zeeland. Elsewhere, those of you who know Denmark know that Zeeland is the big island on which Copenhagen is. Foon is the other major island, which is where Odense, the Hans Christian Andersen's home is, and Jutland is where, among other things, Legoland is. So, and here's Kent, flag of Kent representing Horsa. It's the flag today of Kent, and both Hengist and Horsa's name means horse. Hengist means horse as a stallion in Old English. So now the king of, let me see what have I done here? Let's go backwards here. I got myself lost here a little bit. Okay, here we go. So the King Ethelbert of Kent, who was a Jute, gave Anglo-Saxon England its first law. The Romans no longer ran England, so there was no Roman law. Christianity hadn't come, so there was no Roman law to Christianity. But Ethelbert brought Christianity into England because Gregory sent Constantine 597 to see this man. They opened Canterbury Cathedral. Canterbury means the place of the Kentish men. And suddenly he had monks to do the writing for him. And so in 600 he wrote the first written law of England. And in that written law, as I said, once the king converted to Christianity, the king had access to Canterbury, he could write this law. Now, Jewish law involved freedom for everyone. Even hundreds of years later, they say Kentish men are born free. And it guaranteed everyone to the lowest person, who were churls. We get the expression churlish from the lowest peasant workers, were free. And they were the largest portion of Kent's population. And with the right to inherit land, participate in public assemblies, compensate for injuries, to pay fines, not get punished, to marry, all kinds of things that were significant for freedom at that time. Now, the Jews also brought the thing to England, the thing that Tacitus wrote about. These are laws from Kent. The first talking about the king calling the Liad, meaning his people, to him. The second, in 680, the pair of kings had a law against bothering somebody going to a thing, a ping. That says that the Jewish kingdom of Kent had a thing, the thing that Tacitus was writing about. And then there's further law 15 years later where it talks about making law in unison with the people, with the agreement of all, and approving customs with the Kentish people. All of that is thing governance. So the fact is that the thing has a long tradition in Jutland, the way I tell it. And that's because Tacitus makes a mistake. Tacitus includes among the tribes of Germania, for whom he's describing this democratic behavior, a tribe called the Cimbri. And the Cimbri were from Jutland. They were a huge tribe from Jutland that in the 2nd century BC migrated through Germania to attack Roman armies and destroyed several of them until they were finally defeated. But Tacitus says that tribe remained with a small state in Germania and was included in his description of this kind of democratic tribal life. So that says that hundreds of years before the kingdom of Kent and the Jews brought the thing into the kingdom of Kent, there were things in Jutland. So it's a long tradition. So where do we go from here? The Jews also had a custom that is known as gavelkind. Now, that's another new word for you. Suffice it to say that gavelkind is a system of pardonable inheritance, meaning you divide your property on death if you die without a will, intestate, among all your in this case, males, as opposed to primogeniture, where the firstborn, the first male, gets all the property. A lot of people came to the United States to find their fortunes here because they were second or third born, and they wouldn't inherit in England. So primogeniture was a big factor in feudal England and a big factor in migration to the United States. So what Kent practiced was gavelkind, which was a distribution when you die intestate among and what happened is each generation had to divide the property among all the heirs. So properties got smaller and smaller and smaller. And that was the Jeffersonian idea of the yeoman farmer as at the core of American democracy. Remember, Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations came out in 1776, the year of independence, the freedoms of that individual were fundamental thinking in American thought, getting rid of mercantilism. And that's Jefferson's idea of the yeoman farmer, the small businessman, the property owner who owns it all. So, well, then the other aspect of gavelkind is the word gavel, which in Old English means rent. And that meant that people in Kent could not be tied to the land by obligations. The presumption was that they were gavelled, that their property was divided, and the property, you could hold the property as long as you paid rent. So if you were working in the land of another, you paid rent, and that was part of this gavel-kind expectation. So the result of all this is that Kent had a larger portion of freeholders, free men, not tied by obligations to lords or people like that, than any of the other kingdoms in Anglo-Saxon England. So the question is Ethelbert the most important Anglo-Saxon king? In England, we talked that Alfred the Great is the greatest king. I would question that, because Ethelbert, by the time he was king in 600, was the most powerful figure in all of England. He was the Bretwalda, they called him. Everyone agreed. And he was Bretwalda, and he was the lord over all of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms in England. Also, his prominence was so extraordinary that he could marry the daughter of the king of Paris, and the king of the Franks, and who was the granddaughter of Clovis I, who established the Merovingians after, in France and in the middle area. The Merovingians came in as soon as the tribes began to come together before the Charlemagne and that. Anyway, he also, Pope Gregory sent Augustine to King Ethelbert of Kent to spread Christianity. Ethelbert became the first Christian king. It's a Jute, not a Saxon, not an Anglo, a Jute from Scandinavia, became the first Anglo-Saxon king. And Ethelbert founded Canterbury and St. Paul's cathedrals. He also gave Anglo-Saxons first written law, and the King of Kent remained independent until the 9th century. Okay, so if the Kingdom of Kent and the Jutes were so important, then why didn't England and America teach the Jutes to their populations? And the answer is this. We only have 3 real sources of history of Anglo-Saxon England. We have we have the Venerable Bede, who was a monk who was in Northumbria, which is an Anglo place. He lived his whole life in Anglo stuff. He never left it, never went down and saw Kent. We had Gildas, as I mentioned, who was a Briton who talked about the Britons fighting the Saxons, and we had King Alfred of Wessex, who was a Saxon. So you had a Briton, a Saxon, and an Anglo writing everything we know about the period. There were no Jutes writing. They were pagans. They didn't have language to write in. So that didn't exist. So that's why the whole story of Anglo-Saxon England is about the Angles and the Saxons. Okay. Now, in nearby East Anglia, which is about 100 miles north of Kent, there is evidence of Scandinavian involvement as well. First, there is a site called Sutton Hoo. There's a picture here of Sutton Hoo, which is a burial of a Scandinavian ship. And burying prominent people in their ship was part of Scandinavian society, and it was thought, it's dated 625, it was thought to be the burial place for the Redwall, King Redwall of East Anglia, and who died 624. And because Sutton Hoo is only 6 miles from the capital of East Anglia, and Redwall was a grandson of someone who was part of the Wolfenglass tribe from Sweden. And in Beowulf, there's a description of a burial in a ship, which fits exactly the Sutton Hoo model. And Beowulf, of course, is a story about Scandinavia. So, okay, so what's the truth about the Saxons in England? The truth about the Saxons in England is that they and their Witan were aristocratic. They weren't democratic. The Witan, as this says, the king made law in 680 with my alderman, my bishop, the distinguished Witan of my people, and all this. The Witan Wittengemot was the council of the wise, aristocratic, not democratic. The Witan was the supreme council of the Saxon kingdoms. The Witan was summoned by the king. Its members were aristocrats. Witan approved new kings. Witan approved laws. So Jefferson was wrong. Saxon government was aristocratic, not democratic. Okay, after the 8th century, things happened. The Saxons gained power. There was the development of large tracts of land with manors on them. And we've heard about manors and lords of the manor. And Saxon governments continued to be very top-down. The kingdoms were divided into shires, ruled by aldermen appointed by the kings. They're divided into countries, each to hundreds, ruled by a reeve appointed by the king. And there were some local assemblies, but basically the whole thing was top-down, not bottom-up. And the manorial development with these long tracts of lands is that people did work on the lands of others. Villages were sometimes included in manors. And so a lot of things happened, which I will describe a little bit to say, but you can see there the way these were constructed. You had the church, you had meadows put aside for stuff, you had the manor. The area of the manor, the lord's property is called a domain. And so we had those who worked the domain, those who worked other lands, but they all owed fealty to the Lord unless they had a different status. And that's the way, under manorialism, the way the status broke out is you had people in villenage, meaning they had obligations for the land that controlled their lives, and those in free soccage who didn't, who could dispose of the land they wanted and were free in their ownership. So Kent's tenures generally were free soccage, and they had the freedom of all this, of the types of tenure you could have. Theirs were free. Also, 85% of Kentish farms were dispersed rather than nucleated. That meant there was fewer manors in Kent, and free soccage subject to Gallican presumed smaller properties and developed smaller properties. So, I'm going to try to get through this faster. So the second chapter is the Vikings, the attack by the Vikings on England. And that started at the end of the 8th century, and you had first attacks on monasteries in Scotland and England. And the big warrior there, Ragnar Lodbrok, who attacked France and then went to attack England with only a couple of ships. He was captured by the king of Northumbria and thrown into a pit with vipers that killed him. And the result of that was that Ragnar Lodbrok's sons, Halfdan, Ivar the Boneless, will lead the great heathen army of Vikings to avenge the death of their father in this snake pit. And this is the great heathen army that came in 865 in England and took over most of England. It took over Northumbria, it took over Mercia, it took over East Anglia. And finally, it went down to attack. They captured the king of Northumbria who had killed his father, and they subjected to something called the bloody eagle, where you lie something down, face down, and you cut through his bones and pull out his lungs so it looks like an eagle. And that's the way that said he was killed. So anyway, aside from these sons coming down, another Viking they got from came in with a great summer army. So he had two major armies in England to take over England. And ultimately, King Alfred in Wessex, in the most powerful of the Saxon states, withstood battles by Guthrum, the Summer Army, and the Great Heathen Army, and a treaty was made between Guthrum and Alfred. In that treaty, the Danes were given half of England to rule. The half of England that they were given is called the Dane Law. And under the treaty of Guthrum and Alfred, the Viking armies divided up property, and they took over the Dane Law. Dane Law is between 25,000 and 30,000 square miles of a total of 50,000 square miles, more than half of England. Now the Viking people who came into Danelaw, they were primitive. They came from Scandinavia. They weren't literate. They had no writings except for runes, a certain primitive kind of you write on rocks with. So they didn't have writings. They didn't speak Old English. They spoke Norse. So they couldn't speak the language. They couldn't write the language. They came and what did they bring with them? They brought their tribal law, and they settled the Dane law with tribal law. So, among the things they did is all the governance in the Dane law, local governance by Scandinavians, were with things and local assemblies that they bring together. And places like Thingwall indicate the presence of things. And so they also, because they were pagans, destroyed all the monasteries, which meant, among other things, that there was no one to write down new charters and deeds and laws. So it all fell into a tribal world again in England until they assimilated and learned other stuff. We had all kinds of words, Norse words, and the English language at that time. Words like egg and knife and sister and lay and anger and all kinds of words we've inherited from the Norse. So the proof of freedom in the Dane law is that after the Norman conquest, the report by the Domus book was that 1/4 of those in the Dane law lived as free, meaning free soccage, without obligations on the land. And they're called sokemen. And that the freemen appeared only in large number in the Dane law. Now, among the things that encouraged this freedom in the Dane law was the fact that the soil in the north and east of England was very tough soil to plow through with an ard, with a single blade, through the whole thing. But after the 8th century, they brought in something called like a karakut, which was a plow with a wheel and with a blade across that would lift up the earth, and it would be taken by oxen. But the effect of that was, among other things, but I should also say, the people who came in to settle after, tens of thousands came into England to settle after the Vikings in the Danelaw, and these people were of the Bondi class, which was a class in Scandinavia of free men who could bear arms and attend thing assemblies. That's how they were defined. And they are the ones who came into the Danelaw and participated in this local governance. Now, the thing about the Karuka plow was that because most people couldn't afford an oxen, or a team of 8, which is what they had, they had to share it, and they had to manage the fields. Now, because oxen can't be turned very well, the land was plowed in long strips. That's where we get the expression furlongs, about 1/8 of a mile. Furlong, and which are the sellions I showed you, those long strips of land, which were part of open field farming after the 8th century. And that joint ownership of land, fields, and oxen was an alternative to the manorial structure, which kept a lot of people enslaved. It helped to create freedom in the Danelaw. Similarly, and the Kruger plow caused the unit called the hide, Saxon unit, which measured land as the land required to support a household, with the plowland, which was the land that a team of oxen could plow in a year or in a season. Anyway, so that was much more egalitarian because the hide, you could describe it any way from Sunday, and they did. But this made things more equal. Also, when the Vikings went through the area and destroyed all the monasteries, they destroyed and took over all the aristocrats' land and divided among all the soldiers. That took away bookland. It took away charters and writings to prove ownership, and reverted ownership to a tribal way of owning. Again, encouraging freedom and independence from authority. And so, when the Saxon kings came back and took back the Danelaw, they didn't really take it back. They left the Danelaw in place. And they allowed laws to say that the Danes could continue to govern themselves. And so thereafter, in the 10th century, King Edgar, who was grandson of Alfred, says that the Danes are going to continue to make their own constitution and run themselves as they want. And that was what happened when England became one. The Danelaw still existed, there were Saxon kings, but the Danelaw remained self-governing. I'll just mention that the best example we have of thing is in Iceland, where there was no king. There was simply, starting with 930 AD, things. And today, the legislature of Iceland is the all-thing. It's a unicameral legislature, as are all the thing assemblies throughout Scandinavia. Unicameral, no upper chamber, none of the stuff that we're talking about. And the free and approved customary law and all that stuff. And that's the site of the all thing, the national meeting place, the thing there in Iceland today. So anyway, the king of Denmark, when I talk about runes and primitive writings, those are runes. That's what runes mean. If you can see this writing, it's very primitive stuff here. And so the king of Denmark was Bluetooth, and what that rune says is the king of Denmark unified Denmark and brought Christianity to Denmark. That's Bluetooth. And the reason Bluetooth is called Bluetooth in all of our equipment is because it's the idea of bringing a lot of technologies together. And that's what Bluetooth did. He brought all these different groups together in Denmark. And Jelling is the first, in Jutland, is the spiritual birthplace and capital of Denmark. So, pressing on. The son of Edgar, who allowed everything to be great for the Danes, was a guy named Ethelred the Unready. And he tried, unready really meant ill-advised, and he tried to calm the Danes and stop the Viking invasions, but they continued. And the worst thing about it was that the Vikings in Normandy, which is named the land of the Northmen, gave sanctuary to the Vikings who attacked England. And so Ethelred was always in trouble. Ethelred the Unready was always in trouble with the Vikings. They tried to attack Normandy to stop them providing sanctuary, but the Vikings came back. They attacked. The Pope intervened to try to make a deal so Normandy wouldn't provide sanction for the Vikings attacking England, but it was violated. So after these attacks, Ethelred finally got pissed off. He thought the Danes in the Danelaw were conspiring with the Vikings and attacking him, and he ordered the massacre of all Danes in England in what's known as St. Brice's Massacre. It wasn't successful in doing that, but in certain places like Oxford, all of the Vikings went into a church and they burned the whole church down. There's a big burial site in Oxford where this happened in 1002. Well, unfortunately for Ethelred the Unready, among those he killed during this genocide was the sister of the king of Denmark, Forkbeard, who was Bluetooth's son. And so Forkbeard led a massive attack for many years to revenge the killing of his sister. And the result of that, he attacked London. London Bridge is falling down. That Ethelred had to flee. He tried to stop the Norman acceptance of all these helping Vikings by marrying the sister of a Norman duke, Richard II. But that didn't work, and Richard II, they violated the treaty, and so in the end, Ethelred had to flee England with his son, who was Edward the Confessor, later King of England, and he lived in Normandy with the brother of his wife, Emma of Normandy, who he married to try to stop Normandy from helping the Vikings. So, when he left, King Thorkbad declared himself the first Viking king of England. And his successor, Viking king, was Canute, who had the first freestanding army known as Thingmen, and they had all-thing meetings, and the law of Canute said that Edgar's law of keeping the Danes free to govern themselves would stand, and that continued. So here are the various Viking kings of England that preceded. Edward the Confessor is told by English historians as an Anglo-Saxon, but the fact is he lived his entire life in Normandy. His mother was a Viking. His whole life was Vikings or Norman, and he put Norman people into his government, not Saxons. Anyway, that's a long debate. Last chapter in all this is Normandy. So in Normandy, the Vikings took Paris, and in 9/11, there was a lot of battles in Paris. They sieged Paris, and finally in 9/11, the king of France gave to Rollo, this Viking who put a siege around Paris, he gave him Normandy, which means land of the Northmen, which means land of the Vikings. And that's where we get Normandy. And the Normans after that took over Brittany, and the Vikings, dukes of Normandy, were all successors of the Viking Rollo. So here are their things. Their Danish identity is sometimes debated, not for me, because there's a piece of literature which talks about Rollo's grandson being sent to Bayeux in Normandy to learn Danish, which says that preserving the Danish tradition is important. So, and this is the question whether Edward Confessor was a Norman or a Viking. I'm not going to get into it here. So, when Edward the Confessor died, and there was no succession, the Norman dukes who wanted Edward to have been the King of England invaded. And what's not told or understood is that when the Normans invaded England at the Battle of Hastings, they came in Viking dragon ships. And that's shown by the Bayeux Tapestry. You can see the dragons and the ships. So this is a Viking attack. And so the Bayeux Tapestry was created in Canterbury by the brother of William the Conqueror, Odo, who was the Archbishop of Bayeux and became the Archbishop of Canterbury, and Earl of Kent, and so and they arrived just south of Kent. So, under Normandy's Vikings, they destroyed the Anglo-Saxon aristocracy. William the Conqueror took ownership of all the land, allowing nobles and others to work on the land with obligations to him to provide help. That's what we call feudalism. And took many Saxon hundreds and turned them into provintakes, more of these thing-based districts. And he made his half-brother Otto the Archbishop of Kent. And he replaced allodial industry, this free ownership, with feudal tenures, except in Kent. In Kent, he made an exception from feudalism. He gave Kent the right to continue with Galvokine and their local customary practices, which continued all the way into English history. And I'm now, and basically, the report of the report was that Kent remained the freest of all the counties in England under feudalism. And the Domesday Book says chiefly in Danelaw and East Anglia, a group of sokemen, these free men who weren't obligated, different from the churls and the villainy, the villanage, there was the obligation to help your manor owner, lord, much more greater independence. And the legacy of Gallican and free soccage was that all Kentmen are born free. And that's the way it was told forever. And by dividing property on death equally among children, it broke up the large tracts of land, gave Kent perhaps the largest number of free small property owners of any county in England per Domesday. And the legacy of the Anglo-Saxon kingdom from the Jutes from Scandinavia established was the yeoman farmer of which Thomas Jefferson dreamt. So the legacy of all this is that free peasants, according to the Domesday Book, formed the largest group among the peasantry, and they were in large numbers only in the Danelaw counties, and their numbers very considerable. Up to half of the rural population were free in Kent. So, and William allowed customary law to continue. All the next 150 years, all of the kings of England were direct descendants of the Viking Rollo. It's a Viking heritage in England, which were the kings of England. And until England abolished feudalism, Kent remained the freest of all counties. And the Magna Carta was a negotiation between a descendant of Rollo. He was the king was a direct lineage descendant of the Viking Rollo. And the barons with whom he negotiated greater freedom for England were all descendants of Viking peasants Viking settlers who came down after Rollo to settle in England. Magna Carta was essentially a negotiation among Vikings. I might say that the American colonies were chartered to be free by James I with the language generally that he was giving the land to whoever he gave it to, as the manor in the county of Kent in free and common soakage. He gave it with the Kent tenure of freedom. That's how the colonies had the right to govern themselves and choose and not owe chivalry, obligations of military support for the king. So, but Thomas Jefferson might have learned from a Scandinavian telling of the Anglo-Saxon story is that the siege of democracy, freedom, and yeomanry in Anglo-Saxon England was not a Saxon story. It was a Scandinavian story. And the Scandinavians could have provided Jefferson a much more powerful model. What Scandinavian governments taught is the roots of constitutional republicanism, that law must be based on the consent of the people, being in one deliberative body with all freemen and participating. The rule of law involves a Norse term, a Scandinavian term, regulates the relations between various strata of society, customary and statutory law, common law and statutory side by side. The king is a law keeper, and small and free property owners are the alternative aristocracy and servitors. The Jewish Gallican and Kent is a proven way to achieve this. So I'm not going to go into this stuff. This is the fact that in Tacitus, he missed the fact. Tacitus, in writing about Germania, may have simply been writing about the Scandinavians, because the group that the Romans feared the most were the Cimbris from Germany. The Cimbris defeated the largest army Rome had mustered since the Second Punic War and created such a panic in Rome that the threat of the Cimbris would be remembered even in Tacitus' times as the Terra Cimbricus. So Tacitus knows he had a small state, but Tacitus wrote his Germania describing 50 different tribes in Germania with one single brush, one single color. So what did he use for the model? If he used the Cimbri, he was using a Scandinavian model. So, And I went back and looked at a lot of writing around the time, being the 17th century, when Edward Coke and people were using this ancient constitution, Commonwealth stuff, and I found a lot of confusion about it, which says that maybe it was a Cimbries after all. And my conclusion from all this, I'm sure you're delighted to get this point, here it is that awareness of their democratic thing heritage encouraged the Scandinavian countries to become among the most democratic on earth, which is what they are today. Unawareness of their democratic thing heritage helped England and America oblivious to how undemocratic were the constitutional balances that Polybius, Edward Hyde in England, and John Adams influenced them to accept. Thank you very much.